Chapter 18. The Weird Ceremony. The doorman at Mrs. Rossmeyer's home did not question Nancy and Ned. They went into a large hall, and from there into the living room where a reception line had formed. Mrs. Rossmeyer was heavily covered with jewelry from head to toe. Nancy was amazed that she wore no necklace, however. Her white satin dress was covered with gems that sparkled in the artificial light. Even its standing collar and long sleeves were embroidered with numerous pearls, diamonds, rubies, and emeralds. "She's decked out like a Christmas tree," Ned whispered to Nancy. The young sleuth suppressed a smile and stared at the woman. She did not look at all like Nancy had pictured her. She was very thin, had prominent cheekbones, and a determined-looking chin. Her hair was straw-colored, and there was an overabundance of rouge on her cheeks. "I expected her to be beautiful," Nancy said to Ned in a low, disappointed tone. He grunted almost inaudibly. "She lets her gems make up for her looks." Nancy glanced along the receiving line and around the room. She did not see Mr. Moto, the jeweler. "I wonder where he is," the young sleuth thought. In a few minutes, she and Ned moved up to the head of the receiving line, where Mrs. Rossmeyer was shaking hands with various guests, kissing some, and whispering into one woman's ear. When Nancy reached the hostess, the girl said, "We appreciate your invitation. Your party is wonderful." On the spur of the moment, she decided not to use her right name. "I'm Nan Drury," she added, "and this is my friend Edward Nixon." Mrs. Rossmeyer stared hard at them, but made no comment. She turned to the Japanese man on her left. "I would like you to meet Mr. Moto," she said. Startled, Nancy shook hands with him and asked, "By any chance are you related to Mr. Moto, the jeweler from River Heights?" "No, I am not," was the answer. Ned shook hands with the slightly built man, but asked no further question. "I hope you enjoy your trip to Japan," he said. "I am sure I will," Mr. Moto replied, and the couple moved on. They mingled with the crowd, but realized that they knew no one, and none of the guests spoke to them. So their conversation was confined to admiring the gorgeous paintings, rugs, and tapestries with which the mansion was furnished. As they walked back into the center hall, Nancy and Ned heard a strange noise upstairs. Curious, they went to the second floor. In one of the beautifully furnished bedrooms, an elderly American woman, dressed in evening attire and wearing a lot of pearl jewelry, was seated on the side of a bed. She rocked back and forth rhythmically, muttering to herself. She paid no attention when Nancy and Ned walked through the open door. Wondering if the woman were ill and needed help, Nancy went closer. The old lady was mumbling in a sing-song voice. Ned grabbed Nancy's arm. "She's nuts," he whispered. "If I were you, I wouldn't get too near her. You never can tell what people like that will do. She may attack you." Nancy heeded Ned's warning, but listened carefully to the muttering. Finally, she managed to distinguish a few words. Sacred, nacre, moon, high tides. The woman was not only rocking, but rolling her eyes from one side to the other. She repeated the same words over and over and added, "Full moon, beautiful shell, lovely pink." Nancy whispered to Ned, "These terms were used in ancient times in the pearl cults." Quickly, she explained a little about this to him, then added, Maybe this woman belongs to a modern pearl-worshipping cult. Ned looked disgusted. She belongs at a funny farm. Nancy hardly paid attention to what he was saying. She wondered if the woman was in a trance, or for some reason, was she acting? The stranger finally stopped muttering and began to moan, her voice rising and falling. Ned said, "I can't stand any more of this. It's driving me off my rocker." Nancy consented to leave. When they walked out of the bedroom, an American man in evening clothes came up to them. He smiled and said, "Mrs. Rossmeyer would like to see you in her private quarters." Ned hesitated, looking at Nancy. He felt they might be walking into a trap. Nancy nodded almost imperceptibly, then started to follow the man. Ned went along reluctantly. The stranger led them down the long hallway to a door. He clicked on a wall light, then opened the door. Nancy and Ned saw a narrow corridor in front of them. Did this lead to Mrs. Rossmeyer's private quarters? The young couple entered the corridor, and the door behind them locked itself. Their guide suddenly began to sprint toward a door at the far end of the narrow hall. Before Nancy or Ned could catch him, he had slipped through the door and pushed it shut. Ned tried to open it, but the door was locked. Then the light in the hallway went out, and they stood in total darkness. Together they groped their way to the other door. It too was locked. Nancy and Ned were trapped. For a moment, the young people stood motionless, thoughts racing through their minds. Suddenly, Nancy grabbed her friend's arm. "Ned, the keys!" she whispered. "Let's try all those keys Dad gave us." "That's the best idea you've had all night," Ned murmured, and pulled out his key ring. As silently as possible, he tried one key after another. None of them fit. After he had fumbled with the last one, he sighed. "That's it. Now let me have yours, and hope we have better luck." Nancy handed him her set, and patiently the young man tried again. Finally, one of the keys went into the keyhole. Ned maneuvered it carefully, gritting his teeth. Tensely, he turned it, but the key stuck. Ned jiggled it back and forth, and then turned it again. This time it worked. He opened the door a crack. "Wow," he said, wiping his wet forehead in relief. The young people tiptoed out into the larger hallway. No one was in sight, but weird-sounding Asiatic music drifted from the first floor. The couple listened for a moment. There were no other sounds. "What's going on?" Ned asked. "I don't know, but I mean to find out," Nancy replied with determination. "It's evident that whatever is taking place, Mrs. Rossmeyer and Mr. Moto didn't want us to see it." Carefully, Nancy and Ned made their way to the stairs. They saw that no one was in the downstairs hall. Apparently, all the guests had assembled in the living room. The young sleuth stood in silence for a few moments, then motioned for Ned to follow her. Cautiously, the two sneaked down the steps to the first landing. From this vantage point, they could see everything clearly. Both gasped. Ned whispered, "I can't believe it." In the center of the living room, a small red velvet and gold throne had been set up. Mrs. Rossmeyer was seated on it, a pearl tiara on her head. The electric lights had been turned out, and hundreds of candles illuminated the strange scene. The guests had put on long white ceremonial robes over their evening clothes and formed a long line. They began marching around Mrs. Rossmeyer. As each one approached her, he or she bowed and then kneeled. "What do you think this means?" Ned asked Nancy, a puzzled look on his face. "It's some kind of weird cult," Nancy replied. "I think I know what it is. Tell you later." Behind the woman seated on the throne stood a Japanese man. He held up a large purple velvet banner with a beautiful open pink shell painted on it. Attached to one corner was a huge white pearl. The thought flashed through Nancy's mind. Could this be the 13th Pearl stolen from Mr. Moto's shop? After the last guests had paid obeisance to Mrs. Rossmeyer, everyone began to dance to the weird music. The performers moaned and cried and rolled their eyes as the woman on the bed had done. "This is crazy," Ned declared. "We must call the police." Nancy nodded. "Let's get out of here. I hope no one sees us." The two young people tiptoed down the stairs as fast as they could. Nancy held her breath and kept her eyes on the open living room door, hoping no one would notice them going past. No one did, and when they reached the front door, the uniformed man was not in sight. Nancy and Ned breathed sighs of relief and slipped quietly out into the darkness. They ran to Ned's car, and he started it. As he drove along the rutted lane, Nancy put a hand on his right arm. "Ned, before we notify the police, let's go to the newspaper office." End of chapter 18.